Welcome back to Get Mossed. Last week we saw some big blowouts, possibly the closest game we could see all year. Like normal, we will get into recaps, projections, some quotes from around the league, and highlights from last week. Before we do get into that, we would like to take a moment to recognize our other shows, as they have had nothing but kind things to say about our new startup show here at Get Mossed. So make sure to tune in to Fans State and the TC show this week. And who knows, we may see a collab with them in the future. So let's go ahead and get into some projections and recaps from this week. We're going to start off with a little bit of a recap segment here this week. We're going to go to our game of the week last week, and Diggs in a Blanket and Ricky Stenicki. Ricky Stenicki did take the win over Diggs in a Blanket, who had a lot to say last week. Saying they would guaranteed score over 110, and they did come up short at 109.88. Ricky Stenicki scored 118 even this week. They were carried by a big week from Puka Nacua, the number one fantasy wide receiver, who had a long rushing touchdown. Zach Ertz with his 18.4 point performance, while Diggs in a Blanket relied heavily on just about everybody for him, but nobody had a big enough week to overcome Ricky Stenicki. Moving on from our game of the week, we are going to go into our biggest blowouts of the week. Big week for blowouts. DeMartiaker Rest versus Steelers of Joy. DeMartiaker Rest scored a whopping 149.92. Steelers of Joy only scored 74.69. Joe Burrow did get injured, so it kind of hindered him there. But Derrick Henry also got stifled by Cleveland's defense, as we predicted last week on the show. And another big performance from Christian McCaffrey and Amon-Ra St. Brown propelled DeMartiaker Rest into a huge blowout. Next blowout of the week, we have the Coblins versus Widget. Coblins scored a week-high 151.8 to 92.4, really carried by Malik Neighbors' masterclass in a big Drake May game. We also had a little bit of a revenge story here with Jaylen Warren, who was dropped from Widget last week, picked up by the Coblins for a revenge game, and he scored a huge 17.4 for him this week. Widget did have great games from Jonathan Taylor, but that's about it. And he traded him away. Newsflash. So going on to our next game, we are going to slide over to another blowout here. This one was kind of predicted last week with a blowout win for Coop Cup Clan over Jalissa. Coop Cup Clan scoring 147.9 and Jalissa scoring 117.88. Coop Cup Clan was propelled by a big week by Jamar Chase. Even without Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase gets his. Javonte Williams, another big week with 25. Now, Jalissa did score 117, but it just wasn't enough. And ran into a steamrolling from Coop Cup Clan. Moving on to our next one. Before we do that, we actually do have some words from Coop Cup Clan regarding their matchup next week, but we are going to get in that a little later, so just a little hint for the show. Another big blowout. Team McElhaney versus Daddy's team, with McElhaney scoring 131.3 and Daddy's team scoring 95.14. McElhaney really benefited from big weeks from Devon Achane, James Cook, and Jackson Smith. And also the leader of the Get Mossed White Boy of the Year, Brandon Aubrey, with a big 23 points. Daddy's team could have used a big week from Cortland Sutton, Amarion Hampton, Drake London. But unfortunately, all three of them were bad this week. Hoping to have a bounce back week. We do have a quote here from Daddy's team. Team head coach Daniel Hampton had this to say. He said, "We came out in week one very charged up after getting a big win despite the outside noise. Just came out this week a little flat and clearly wasn't ready to compete. This team has championship experience, and I can promise you they will be ready to play this week and get the victory against Ricky Stenicki." Big words from Daniel Hampton. We will give you a little sneak peek into next week's show. Next week, we are hoping to land an interview with none other than the head coach of Daddy's team, Daniel Hampton, right here on the Get Mossed show. So be on the lookout for that next week. And to start our closest matchup of the week, we do have First Down Syndrome versus Jennifer Aniston. First Down Syndrome scored 107.8, and Jennifer Aniston scored 106.94. This really came down to 9/10 of a point, with big games from Lamar Jackson scoring 26, Jahmyr Gibbs scoring 19.4. A really well-balanced game from Jennifer Aniston this week. Every starter other than two of them scoring 10-plus points. It all came down to that last Monday Night Football game with the Las Vegas Raiders losing to the Los Angeles Chargers. Moving into some projections for next week. We're going to start off with the closest matchup of the week, with the Coblins versus DeMartiac Arrest. Line being set at just 1.5 points before the Thursday Night Football games kick off. DeMartiac Arrest does have one of the best quarterbacks in fantasy this year with Josh Allen in a bounce-back campaign for Christian McCaffrey if he can stay healthy. Who's currently the second best halfback in fantasy. Expecting another big week from Amon-Ra St. Brown. But they're running into a bit of a hit-or-miss defense with Baltimore, so it really depends on how he can do. Moving over to the Coblins. He has big play potential, scoring last week a high of 151 points, as said. We could see another big week with Malik Neighbors as he continues his second-year breakout. Drake May, if he continues to be the elite fantasy quarterback that he's been so far this year. This one, though, I kind of agree with the projection here. I think it's going to be really close. If everybody performs how they're going to, which they never do, I'm still going to give it to DeMartiac Arrest just because of the sheer firepower they have. Now we're going to get up to our next closest matchup of the week. This one also lands into the Get Mossed game of the week, with Coop Cup Clan having some words to say about this one as well. Coop Cup Clan said this, their head coach Thomas Costner: "This matchup is going to be like Cam Mack's fantasy punishment. He's gonna lose. Cam Mack is number one in the real power rankings, not after this week. Glory will be restored to the Coop Cup Clan. Hashtag clan by Fitty." Some big words from Thomas Costner here for his team. Has some really high hopes going into this week. This week, the line is set at 2.3 points now. We do have Cam McElhaney, who's roaring out to 2-0 so far, and has just been dominating his opponents. If he can continue this, he does have the number one halfback through 2 weeks. He has the number one fantasy kicker through 2 weeks. 2 top 10 players in Baker Mayfield and Devon Achane, and nearing top 10 with Jackson Smith. And I think I have to give it to Cam McElhaney just because he's gonna, he has the statue. Psych! We're going Coop Cup Clan by 50 this week. Going for the big upset. Expecting another big week from Travis Etienne against Houston. They've been giving up a lot of rush yards, and especially with a catching back out of the backfield, could have a huge week. We definitely here at the studio think he's going to score more than 12.7. Jamar Chase, any quarterback, you could put Uncle Ricky back there. Jamar Chase is going to get his. He has Trey McBride, top 5 in fantasy. Javonte Williams having a monster season. And Chicago not being able to stop a toddler running out of the backfield, I think he has another big week. Kyler Murray, he's always going to give you a good amount of points. So that's going to be our game of the week. Moving on to our next matchup this week. It's going to be Daddy's team versus Ricky Stanicki. Currently projecting Ricky Stanicki winning by 3.6 points this week. This is with a questionable Jawan Jennings in his flex position, coming off a monster blockbuster trade, as we mentioned earlier, with Jonathan Taylor. He did have to give up a really good wide receiver who is struggling a little bit this year in Brian Thomas Jr. But he has Puka Nacua, the best fantasy wide receiver this year, after breaking off a huge touchdown run last week. We do have Daniel Dimes showing us all up, proving us wrong. He's number 2 fantasy quarterback through 2 weeks. Tennessee's defense also hasn't been able to stop a toddler. So we could see another huge week from Ricky Stanicki, trying to move to 2-1. But you can't count out Daddy's team. He, like we said, he is a former champion. He has won before. He has Tucker Kraft, Saquon Barkley, really volatile group in his receiver room. and Cortland Sutton and Drake London. Given both their quarterback situations, I don't see them being held down like they were last week. But that being said, yeah, we're going to give it to Ricky Stenicki just because that big trade for Jonathan Taylor. Still has Puka Nacua, Zach Ertz. Here in the studio, moving to our next matchup, we have Jennifer Aniston versus Jalissa. Jalissa sitting at 0-2. It's been a disappointing start, but I think she has a big bounce back week running into Jennifer Aniston. Here you have to look at her quarterback with Justin Herbert. Chase Brown, he'll get a couple good touches a game. Alvin Kamara, PPR monster. CeeDee Lamb, Devontae Adams. Really good wide receiver group there. Also have Rome Odunze. If they can get the job done there, it could set up for a big week for Jalissa. Now, on the other side of the table, we do have Jennifer Aniston here. Ashton Genty, Bucky Irving, Jalen Hurts. He's always going to get a tush-push touchdown a week. It's a guarantee. Deebo Samuel, he's a little hit or miss sometimes, but with his rushing potential, we could see him scoring quite a bit. Tyler Warren has turned into the number one option in Indy for Danny Dimes, but he did just get a questionable designation coming into this week. We don't know too much about that here. Don't see it being too much of a big thing. Everything being said, we are going to have to agree with the projection. Jalissa, I think it's time for a bounce back. Stay off the bottom of the standings and out of danger. Moving to our second to last game of our projections, we have Diggs in a Blanket versus Steelers of Joy. Steelers of Joy had a monster regular season last year, and it's kind of sputtering to open up the season this year, sitting at 1-1, and not putting up a whole lot of points. Diggs in a Blanket has been putting up points. 0-2 though on the year. Put up a big week in week 1, but unfortunately ran into Cam McElhaney, so 120 wasn't enough. Only put up 110 last week. Looking at his averages, we could see him putting up roughly 110 points. Now they do have two top 10 players at their positions. In Bijan Robinson, Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce's top 10. And A.J. Brown has been held to averaging 5 points a game this year. But his quarterback, being Jalen Hurts, forgot how to throw a football. We expect A.J. Brown to pick up here soon. Now, on the other side, we do have Steelers of Joy with Derrick Henry. He had a rough week last week against the Cleveland defense, as mentioned previously. But let's look into Detroit's defense as we take a deeper look into their stats. They have given up just a hair over 100 yards a game rushing and about 4 yards per carry. We know Derrick Henry, he's great after contact. Didn't really get a whole lot going last week. Only had, I think, 11 carries, if that. I think we could see a big win from Steelers of Joy. But I think we get a win for Diggs in a Blanket, trying to stay off the bottom of the leaderboard, get their first win of the season. Moving into our final matchup of the week for our projections. This is going to be our biggest line, sitting right now at 25 points. That is with a IR not being replaced in the starting lineup. We're expecting Jordan Mason. Swings at about 14 points, but the line still being at 11 after that. First down syndrome, still heavily favored. Did trade away Jonathan Taylor after a monster week and received Brian Thomas Jr., who has looked a little rough starting this year. Still projected about 15 points down on his bench. We could see him make a couple subs before game time this Sunday. Currently 2-0 on the other side. First down syndrome has number one fantasy quarterback in Lamar Jackson, a top 10 back in Jahmyr Gibbs, a top 10 tight end in Brock Bowers. But I think the biggest variable going into this week that could help this blowout is that Packers defense facing against Cleveland. Cleveland's offense couldn't move the ball if they were playing against a middle school team in the rural area of northwest Idaho. So that being said, Packers could have a big scoring week for a defense. This concludes our projections and recap for the show. But like I said earlier in the show, you do not want to miss next week's show. We could possibly have a big interview with the head coach of Daddy's team, Daniel Hampton. So, that being said, let's get into some highlights and wrap up the show. Going to show some love to our special teams this week. Bangs one through from 64, Brandon Aubrey. Going to Jalen Warren in his revenge game against Widget. Goes over, man. Looking like Mario. Next clip we got here is Puka Nacua slicing through the Titans defense, looking dangerous.
But when I woke up this morning, I was feeling pretty dangerous.
I'm having trouble trying to sleep. I'm counting shit but running out. As time ticks by, still I try.
That was weird. We'll have to look into that. Well, back to the highlights. Joe Flacco looking for the end zone here. Should have been picked off. Tipped and caught for the touchdown by Cedric Tillman. Let's show some defensive love here. Interception off of Pat Mahomes. The world loves to see that. And the touchdown saving tackle, because linemen are athletes too.